Some Japanese officers would later write that fighting U.S. Marines in the Pacific felt like facing warriors who simply did not know how to stop. Across Guadalcanal's jungles in 1942, the Japanese expected another easy victory, yet discovered opponents who fought like predators, advancing through mud, counterattacking in the dark, refusing to break even when exhausted and starving. Reports describe Marines who moved with hunter-like patience and attacked with sudden ferocity, men who treated retreat as unthinkable and survival as the only mission. On Tarawa, Japanese commanders believed no force could seize the island in 100 years, yet watched, in disbelief, as Marines stormed its reefs under withering fire and seized it within days, crawling over shattered sand and burned bunkers with a brutal determination that terrified defenders. Saipan revealed another truth. Even when overwhelmed, Marines absorbed losses and pressed forward with relentless coordination of artillery, armor, and naval gunfire, disciplined, synchronized, and supported by a logistical machine the Japanese could not match. By Iwo Jima, General Kuribayashi warned his men that Marines were unlike earlier American units. Intelligence assessments noted their refusal to abandon wounded, their brutal close-quarters fighting, and their calm precision under fire. On black volcanic sand, the Japanese watched Marines advance yard by yard through smoke and ash, corpsmen sprinting into gunfire to pull the fallen back, and assault teams using tanks, flamethrowers, and explosives with surgical efficiency. Even in defeat, Japanese diaries shifted from dismissive contempt to grudging respect to a quiet fear of a force whose discipline matched their own but whose industrial and logistical strength seemed limitless. Across Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa, the Japanese learned that the Marines did not yield, did not hesitate, and did not stop until they stood on the final ridge, flag rising above smoke and ruin. It was not hatred alone that shaped their view. It was recognition. The Marines represented a foe who combined warrior spirit with overwhelming support, a relentless brotherhood that fought forward no matter the cost, proving that the Pacific was not won by numbers or technology alone, but by men who accepted hell and walked into it anyway. The Pacific, 1942, a world already burning, and the Empire of Japan standing seemingly unstoppable across Asia and the Pacific Rim. Its armies had carved through China, conquered Southeast Asia, and crushed colonial defenses with speed and ferocity the world had not seen in generations. Every map in Tokyo pointed toward victory. Every soldier believed the Emperor's empire would never fall. And in the steaming jungles and scattered islands of the South Pacific, Imperial commanders prepared for one more triumph, crushing an American counterattack they assumed would crumble like all the rest. But a new kind of enemy was coming for them. Not colonial troops, not militia, not retreating armies. The men pushing through the jungle under furious heat and swarms of insects were United States Marines, young, untested, exhausted, but possessing a fierceness the Japanese did not expect. They came from farms, factories, fishing towns, and city blocks. They were riflemen first, fighters always, driven by a code forged long before this war began. Once Marines landed, they did not leave until the job was done. The first great collision would erupt on Guadalcanal, an island few Americans had heard of before the war, but one that would become sacred ground in Marine history. There, Japanese forces believed they would simply sweep the Americans back into the sea. Instead, they ran into relentless resistance. Men who dug in, adapted, hunted at night as fiercely as they defended by day, and counterattacked with a shocking refusal to break. The Japanese officers began to notice patterns. Marines fought in small units with initiative, their non-commissioned officers led fearlessly, and their fire discipline and marksmanship made jungle approaches deadly. In early diaries and reports, Japanese descriptions shifted from dismissive arrogance to uneasy respect. Through Tarawa in 1943, where Marines assaulted reefs under gunfire and clawed across beaches covered in steel and sand, Japanese soldiers realized these men were willing to die to take just one more yard. Through Saipan in 1944, where civilians, soldiers, and commanders witnessed an American force that coordinated tanks, naval artillery, airplanes, and infantry into a single devastating hammer through Peleliu's furnace-hot ridges, where Marines pushed through coral and caves while heat stroke and bullets claimed lives by the minute, and finally through Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, where Japanese commanders called the Marines fighters without hesitation and wrote that their tenacity resembled the very spirit Japan had believed only their warriors possessed. The stakes were not merely territory. These islands were stepping stones to Japan itself. Each one taken tightened the noose and shattered another piece of the imperial dream. Japanese commanders studied why these Marines fought with such steel. They saw a military culture that worshipped discipline, a brotherhood where no man was abandoned, and a doctrine built on aggression and combined arms. They faced flamethrowers clearing bunkers, tanks grinding through trenches, Navy guns shaking mountains, and medical corpsmen who risked death to pull wounded men back to safety. Even as casualties soared, the Marines moved forward. To the Japanese, this was not simply military power, it was a force of will. At the center of this clash were leaders whose names would echo through history. On one side, Marine generals like Holland Howland Mads Smith and Louis Chesty Puller, shaping amphibious warfare into a brutal science. On the other, men like General Tadamichi Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima, who studied American tactics carefully and warned his men that these Marines fought with a spirit equal to Japan's own, a chilling admission in a nation that believed, itself unmatched in warrior tradition. This story matters because it reveals a truth often overshadowed by technology, strategy, or national pride. Wars are decided by human grit as much as machines. The Pacific was not just a clash of empires. It was a proving ground for two warrior cultures convinced of their superiority. Meeting in some of the harshest battlefields on Earth, it teaches us how respect can grow even amid hatred, how endurance can outlast fanaticism, and how brotherhood can carry men through nightmares no human should ever face. What unfolded from Guadalcanal to Okinawa reshaped warfare, defined the Marine Corps legacy, and forced Japan's leaders to confront a military that would not break, not bend, and not stop until the rising sun finally set over the Pacific. This is the story of why Japanese forces came to fear and respect fighting United States Marines more than any other unit. In the months before the first Marine boots touched Guadalcanal, the Pacific hung in a fragile balance. Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea, from Burma to the very edge of Australia. Its soldiers, drilled in a warrior culture steeped in centuries of Bushido, believed they were the most disciplined fighters on Earth. They had swept aside European colonial armies, stormed fortress cities, and pushed the United States back after Pearl Harbor. Each victory fed a growing confidence, one bordering on inevitability. American forces, stunned and bruised, were regrouping across the Pacific, trying to build strength in time to stop a relentless adversary. In Washington, military planners understood the stakes. If Japan fortified and completed its defensive ring, the war could grind into a nightmare stalemate. The United States needed momentum, a foothold, and a chance to break the enemy's aura of invincibility. And so a plan formed, not to attack Japan directly, but to chip away at its outer defenses, island by island. The first target, an obscure jungle-covered island the Japanese had begun turning into an airfield. Guadalcanal, the Marines who would lead the assault were hardly the polished, battle-hardened legends the world now remembers. Many were barely out of high school. Some had never left their hometowns. Their training in California and the South Pacific had been rigorous, but nothing could truly prepare them for what lay ahead. Yet in their ranks simmered determination, a belief that failure was not an option, and a fierce pride in the Marine tradition. One drill instructors had hammered into them with every forced march and rifle drill. On the opposite side, Japanese forces stationed across the Pacific consisted of seasoned soldiers, veterans of brutal campaigns in China and Southeast Asia. They had grown accustomed to decisive victories and viewed Western troops as lacking spirit and resolve. Their commanders, confident in their soldiers' unquestioning obedience and battlefield aggression, believed they could counter any American landing with swift, overwhelming counterattacks. To them, the Americans were soft, untested, and inferior, especially in close combat. Reports about Marines were sparse, and early impressions were dismissive. They saw them simply as another enemy infantry force, no different from the ones they had already beaten. The stage was set. On one side, a rising empire convinced of its destiny. On the other, a nation determined to stop that rise, sending in a young, hungry force eager to prove itself. Conditions on the islands themselves shaped the coming storm. The Pacific landscapes were unforgiving. Dense rainforests, razor-sharp coral, swamps buzzing with disease, and volcanic rock that cut through boots and skin. Tropical heat clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. Mosquitoes carried malaria, flies swarmed over everything, and water sources often brought sickness instead of relief. Under those conditions, the psychological battle began even before shots were fired. Exhaustion, hunger, and tension working their way into every mind. At sea, American carriers, cruisers, and transports braced against unpredictable storms and threats from Japanese submarines. Naval crews whispered prayers, knowing the smallest mistake could send ships to the ocean floor. Above them, reconnaissance. Aircraft swept the skies, trying to locate enemy fleets. Every man understood the fragility of their position. If Japanese forces struck first, the entire invasion could be lost before it began. As dawn rose on August 7, 1942, clouds hung low and humid air clung to the ocean. From the decks of amphibious ships, Marines looked out at the jungled silhouette of Guadalcanal. Some gripped Lucky Charms, others silently reviewed their training, imagining the first sprint off the landing craft, rounds cracking overhead, brothers falling beside them. Yet for a moment, there was only eerie quiet. When the landing craft hit the beaches, no storm of bullets greeted the Marines, just empty shoreline and abandoned construction equipment. The Japanese workers and small garrison had fled into the jungle, surprised and overwhelmed, but early ease masked the nightmare to come. By nightfall, the Japanese were regrouping. Offshore, their navy moved into position. The Marines, still unloading supplies, digging foxholes, and trying to understand the terrain, did not yet know how outnumbered they were. They did not know the Japanese. Commanders, shocked by the landing, had already issued orders: destroy the Americans before dawn, throw them back into the sea, and erase this insult to the empire. Wind rustled palm leaves. Humid air clung thick to sleepless men gripping rifles in new foxholes. The jungle hid movement and swallowed sound. Somewhere in the darkness, Japanese infantry gathered silently, bayonets fixed, preparing for a coordinated night attack, an assault style they believed no Western force could withstand. The Marines had heard rumors about Japanese night fighting skill, but rumors could not match reality. The stage was set for a clash of wills, of instincts, of tactics sharpened by opposite traditions. Whatever the belief had been before, arrogance from one side, confidence from the other, it was about to evaporate in the face of raw, merciless combat. The Japanese were about to meet Marines who refused to be broken, and the Marines were about to discover an enemy who fought with terrifying zeal. Both sides were about to learn that this war would not be swift, nor predictable, nor merciful. It would be a fight for every inch of earth, for every ridge, every palm tree, every scrap of hope. In the humid darkness of Guadalcanal, two warrior cultures collided for the first time, setting into motion a campaign of unimaginable brutality and unshakable resolve. Night fell like a curtain, fast and heavy, swallowing the jungle in blackness. Guadalcanal's heat did not fade. It pressed into the skin, clinging like a fever. Crickets hummed, leaves whispered in the damp breeze. And then, without warning, stillness. Marines gripped their rifles tighter. They had been warned. The Japanese did not attack by day. They came when shadows owned the earth. Suddenly, from deep within the trees, a low roar rose, voices shouting in unison, boots pounding mud, metal scraping. Then muzzle flashes bloomed like fireflies across the tree line. Machine guns barked, mortars thudded, tracer rounds carved red arcs through the dark. The Japanese surge burst from the jungle. Waves of infantry rushing forward, bayonets gleaming in moonlight, convinced their shock attack would shatter American lines. It had worked across Asia. It had broken armies before. But this time, something unexpected met them. Marines who held their ground, rifle fire cracked with disciplined rhythm. Squads moved with calm coordination, rotating positions, conserving ammunition, calling targets. Marines had dug in, sighted fields of fire, whispered instructions in gravel-quiet voices. They had no intention of giving an inch. The first Japanese assault crashed into the line and shattered. Bodies fell, rifles clattered. Yet the survivors reformed and charged again. Grenades exploded. Marines pressed into the earth as shrapnel tore bark from trees and flesh from bone. The air stank of mud, sweat, cordite, and fear. A turning point came when Japanese forces flanked a Marine position, slipping through palms and creeping toward a machine gun nest. The Marines saw shadows move, too smooth, too fast. A squad leader signaled silently when the attackers leapt forward. The Marines counterattacked, bayonets and rifle butts flashing. Darkness hid the violence, only grunts, screams, and the ringing clash of steel revealed the struggle. When silence returned, Marines still held the ground. The Japanese regrouped and launched another charge, this time with bugles sounding, echoing through the night like ancient war horns. Marines later said the sound chilled them more than gunfire. Yet fear did not break them. They braced, breathed, fired, reloaded, and fought. At one point, a Marine radio operator called for illumination. Flares streaked upward and burst in pale fire across the battlefield. In that sudden ghost light, the scene appeared like something from a nightmare. Silhouettes of charging soldiers, palms swaying in smoke, trenches littered with shell casings, and sweat-soaked men bracing for death. What the Japanese saw instead was a wall of Americans, mud-streaked, bloodied, jaws clenched, rifles steady, refusing to bend. A Japanese officer who survived the night would later remark that the Marines fought like they expected to win, not survive. That distinction stunned him. For many Japanese soldiers, sacrifice was the ideal, death in battle was honor. But these Marines fought not to die well, only to live, and to make sure their brothers lived too. Their intensity was not desperation, it was purpose. Hours dragged like days. Ammunition ran low. Marines passed magazines hand to hand along the trenches. Corpsmen crawled through machine gun fire to drag the wounded back. A young Marine, barely old enough to shave, held his friend's hand as he bled in the dirt and whispered steady encouragement while keeping his rifle aimed outward. Then, near dawn, one more push. Japanese troops charging with ferocity born of desperation, they threw grenades, fired rifles until bolts seized, and tried to tear through barbed wire with bare hands. But the Marines answered with everything they had left. Point-blank rifle fire, knives, entrenching tools, fists. It was chaos, brutal and close, until sunlight crept over the treetops. And just like that, the attack ended. Smoke drifted upward through broken foliage. Groans of wounded men filled the humid morning. The Japanese withdrew, leaving silent forms scattered across the jungle floor. The Marines, exhausted, bleeding, grim-faced, remained in their foxholes, rifles still pointed outward, too wired to believe it was over. They had held against elite troops, night tactics, and shock assaults. They had held. Word spread through the Japanese ranks in the days that followed. The Americans had not broken. They had not panicked. They had fought like seasoned warriors in terrain they barely understood, against an enemy they had never faced before. From disbelief came grudging assessment, and then, slowly, respect. This night became the first proof that the Marines were different. They were not colonial troops. They were not untested boys. They were fighters who refused to yield, men who would meet a charge with one of their own, who would bleed but never surrender ground. On Guadalcanal, in that suffocating dark, the Japanese learned a startling truth. The Marines were not merely another enemy force. They were an immovable force of will. Their resolve became the beginning of a legend, one written in sweat, dirt, and blood, beneath a sky lit by burning flares and rising dawn. When dawn finally broke over Guadalcanal, the battlefield lay silent except for the groans of the wounded and the whisper of the jungle reclaiming its stillness. Marines, hollow-eyed and shaking with exhaustion, leaned against muddy trench walls, rifles still clutched tight. Many had not spoken for hours, only fought, bled, listened, waited. Now, as sunlight filtered through the tree canopy, they saw what their determination had cost and what it had earned. Bodies lay thick in front of their lines. Japanese infantry who had charged with fearless devotion, cut down by men who refused to give ground. Marines moved among their fallen comrades, tagging the dead, carrying the wounded, whispering promises to return home, to write to family, to never forget. They worked in silence not only because they were tired, but because they understood this night had been a turning point. They now knew what their enemy was capable of, and what they themselves were capable of surviving. For many Marines, something irreversible changed that morning. The war was no longer distant or heroic, it was raw and intimate, its cost measured in men who had shared their rations yesterday and now lay motionless in the dirt. Fear transformed into resolve, grief hardened into purpose. They had defended their ground. Now they would push forward, no matter how long or how brutal the campaign became. Across the jungle, the shock within Japanese ranks was equally profound. Survivors returned to their positions stunned, hollow, questioning. Their commanders had promised an easy victory, a single decisive attack that would sweep the Americans into the sea. That belief shattered against Marines who held their rifles with steel-steady courage and fought, not as individuals but as a unified machine. Officers wrote of an enemy who did not fear night combat, who did not panic under close pressure, who fought as though retreat was dishonor. In Tokyo, when reports filtered back, they arrived stripped of pride. The Americans, especially the Marines, were not weak. They were not soft. They were dangerous. That realization sparked a shift in Japanese tactical planning, especially for island defenses. No longer could they rely solely on shock assaults and bayonet charges. They began fortifying caves, digging tunnels, preparing the terrain itself to bleed attackers dry. If they could not break American spirit, they would grind it down. Their doctrine evolved not because they wanted to, but because Marines forced them to rethink everything. For the wider war, the night battle on Guadalcanal did more than secure a patch of jungle. It proved to the world, and to the United States itself, that Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance could be halted, that American troops, led by the Marine Corps, could stand toe-to-toe with the Empire's best and not only survive but win. In Washington, the victory electrified strategic minds. Confidence swelled, resources redirected. The Pacific Campaign gained a heartbeat. Back home, families began receiving letters, some triumphant, others heartbreaking. Mothers learned their sons had fought like lions. Some learned they had given everything. Newspapers spoke of tough jungle fighting but did not yet capture the hell these men endured. Only those who crouched behind tree trunks, felt bayonet steel flash in the dark, and heard the final breaths of brothers truly understood. Through Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the lessons of that night echoed. Marines carried with them the memory of Guadalcanal like a forge burns into steel. They trained harder. They expected worse. They moved with the knowledge that courage was not a moment. It was a habit, built under fire and tested in silence. The Japanese, too, remembered. Their respect deepened into caution and caution into fear. They would never again underestimate Marines. The long campaign that followed left islands stained with sacrifice, but in every battle afterward, when Japanese soldiers saw the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor advancing through jungle or crawling up black volcanic sand, they remembered that first encounter, the night their certainty broke and a new truth replaced it. Marines did not run, Marines did not break, Marines did not surrender, and every island they landed on was a promise. They had come to stay. As the Pacific War ground on, this reputation shaped outcomes. It shaped morale, it shaped history. And long after guns fell silent, Japanese veterans would admit with sorrowful respect that fighting Marines demanded everything they had, spirit, strength, and sometimes life itself. For the Marines who walked away from that first night, no victory felt clean. But they had proven something immortal. In the darkest hours when the world watched, they stood firm. And the world learned a truth carved in blood and grit across the Pacific, that when they rose from their foxholes at dawn, they carried the future of the war with them. War is often remembered in dates, territory, and the cold precision of strategy. But beneath every map line lies something far more powerful, the will of the men who stood there. Guadalcanal did not simply mark a shift in momentum. It proved a truth that would define the rest of the Pacific campaign. Victory did not belong to the side with the most soldiers, the largest empire, or the fiercest slogans. It belonged to the side that refused to break. For the Marines, that refusal was not just training, it was identity. Their strength came from something deeper than orders. It came from the belief that they fought for each other, that no man would be left behind, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the insistence to move forward despite it. They fought with grit earned in boot camp, sharpened on rifle ranges, reinforced in whispers between foxholes, when the jungle pressed close and doubt clawed at the edges of their minds. They fought not as lone heroes, but as brothers linked by duty and trust. For the Japanese soldiers who faced them, the lesson was equally profound. They entered the war convinced that their spirit could overcome any enemy. Instead, they found a force whose determination matched their own, and whose resilience was strengthened, not weakened, by hardship. In recognizing this, many Japanese veterans came to respect the Marines not out of admiration for their cause, but because their bravery could not be denied. In the fires of battle, respect sometimes grows where hatred once lived. The legacy of that first clash stretches far beyond the jungle. It shaped how Marines trained, how commanders strategized, and how nations understood the power of unity and resolve. Every battle after Guadalcanal carried an echo of that night, the sound of determined men holding the line against the odds. The memory followed Marines up volcanic slopes on Iwo Jima, across coral reefs at Tarawa, and into Okinawa's maelstrom. The belief held fast. The mission comes first, the brother beside you comes second, and surrender is not in the vocabulary. Stories like these remind us that history is not just about victory, it is about character. It is about what humans endure when the world demands everything from them. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not superhuman, they were scared, they were young, they were far from home. But when the test came, they stood firm, not because they did not fear death, but because they would not yield to it. So the lesson endures. True strength is not measured in force alone. It is measured in spirit, in loyalty, and in the unshakable belief that some ground must be held, no matter the cost. As you reflect on their sacrifice, ask yourself, when the moment comes to stand your ground in your own life, when everything inside you screams to quit, will you hold the line too? When the gunfire faded and the jungle fell quiet, the Marines stood where they had sworn they would. Exhausted, battered, forever changed, but unbroken, that first night on Guadalcanal was more than a battle. It was a declaration. It told the world, and it told Japan, that the United States Marine Corps would not be pushed back, would not yield, and would not surrender their ground to anyone. From that moment onward, every island, every ridge, every assault carried the same message. These were warriors driven not only by duty, but by a fierce loyalty to one another and an iron belief in finishing what they began. The Japanese had entered believing they faced another army. Instead, they met a brotherhood forged in fire, a force whose strength lay not in numbers, but in spirit, discipline, and resolve. And once that truth emerged from the smoke and darkness of Guadalcanal, the course of the Pacific began to turn. One night of courage became the foundation for an entire campaign. From jungle to volcanic ash, from terror to triumph, the Marines proved a simple truth. When the world demanded the impossible, they held the line.